and welcome to Outside the Box Radio for the 26th day of February in the year 2015. I'm Alex Ansary, coming to you from the most gentrified city in all North America. That would be Portland, Oregon, USA. And it's great to be back right here on American Freedom Radio, AmericanFreedomRadio.com. Today marks day 2 since the station's relaunch, and I'm glad they're back. I'm looking forward to bringing a number of guests to the show in the near future. My website, by the way, is alexansary.tv, and the newer updated version may be coming as soon as next week, and it will be there that you'll have quick access to some of the archived interviews that I've done over the years, as well as the archives, the interviews that you hear on this network. Today we approach the subject of geoengineering with Dane Wigington of GeoEngineeringWatch.org. And I'm in Portland, Oregon, and there's a number of people that are aware of the geoengineering issue that we're starting to see a lot of it here on the West Coast. Now, what I've heard from others is that the jet stream moves across the nation. There may be a reason why there's a lot of geoengineering on the West Coast of the United States. And this has been kind of a fringe issue for years. But there are more and more people that are looking at the issue. There's a number of scientific terms that can be used to describe what is going on. It's no longer just referred to as chemtrails. You know, there are scientists in the movie What in the Hell Are They Spraying? And other videos you can find online. But they're talking about fighting global warming by spraying toxic chemicals, metals in the air to reflect solar particles. Okay, so they're obviously insulting people's intelligence. And obviously, there's a blind spot, a common sense blind spot with many people with realizing that we're being lied to. And like a lot of people, I struggle with a sense of powerlessness. You know, what do I do about it? And that's why it's not a full-time issue on my YouTube channel and on the show, as there are many other things going on that need our full attention. But anyone on the search for truth cannot ignore this issue. Anyone truly on the path, on the search for truth, is not going to be catapulting propaganda that it's just simply a contrail, that all this is just natural, that there's no actual, design behind it. And there's also days where I see on social media where multiple people, for example, in Portland, will be posting pictures of what they're seeing. And we're seeing 9, 10, 11, 12 lines in the sky. We're seeing tic-tac-toe. We're seeing these, might as well be geometry and all these other. It's like, what is going on? And I've also seen some people send me texts and asking the question, are they drunk today? I mean, what are they doing? They're going round and round. So we're seeing it get a little bizarre in terms of what techniques they're actually using. So what is going on here with weather wars, manufactured droughts, these times where we see massive downpours of rain and other strange weather anomalies? Now, I believe that climate change is real, but more or less that we're impacted by the changing of the solar flare activity and a fluctuation and weakening Earth's magnetic field. Those two factors together dramatically impact weather patterns and other things on our planet. The question is, when do the natural changes end and geoengineering begins? In what ways are the powers that be trying to exacerbate natural climate change? And in what ways are they supposedly trying to halt the effects of what they say is causing climate change? They blame it on man, but here they are saying that they're going to spray the skies to fight climate change to reflect particles from the sun. I mean, this is classic mad scientist material. So we know that they claim that geoengineering can block solar particles and fight global warming, but anyone willing to accept this fallacy that spraying toxic chemicals is somehow good for anything, the idea is absolutely absurd. And if people are willing to believe that insanity, perhaps they can be conditioned and manipulated to believe other absurd false truths. Something is not quite right with blocking out the sun. Now, the sun is something that I've talked about quite a bit on my videos and in my radio shows for years, the connection between our consciousness and the sun of our skies, in our skies. So there's definitely some sort of other agenda, I think, at play with a real reason that they're involved in geoengineering. We go now to Dane Wigington to provide some light on this issue. Just a little bit of information about our guest. Dane has a background in solar energy, is a former employee of Bechtel Power Corp, and was a licensed contractor in California and Arizona. He has been engaged in constant climate geoengineering research for over a decade. He lives currently in Shasta County, California, and his website is geoengineeringwatch.org. He's known as a leader in the geoengineering movement, the movement to raise greater awareness, that is, as to what's really happening above our skies. Dane, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Alex. The problems are across the board. In fact, this morning our website was down for 4 or 5 hours with unusual troubles. 2 weeks ago, Facebook reach cut us back by 95%. We have a lot of people that help us with various tasks. They're having issues as well. So it's you're not alone, my friend.
Give us kind of an introduction to some of the things that you research and some of the projects that you've been involved in, outreach. I saw that you were giving a lecture online that was getting very specific and detailed in this issue. Kind of give us an overview into your background.
Again, my name is Dane Wigington. I'm the lead researcher administration for the website GeoEngineeringWatch.org. There's no advertisement on our site, no politics. The reason I focus exclusively on this issue, Alex, is because I believe if all the data surrounding it is examined, it is the biggest untold story on the planet right now. It affects every living thing. What got me into this issue, I have a background in renewable energy with Bechtel Power. My home was on the cover of the world's largest renewable energy magazine when I moved to the Pacific Northwest expecting to find clean air and clear skies, and began losing 60, 70, sometimes 80% of my solar power from whatever these aircraft were leaving behind. Clearly something was going on. I began to test rain and found levels of the same elements listed in geoengineering patents. Geoengineering, again, is the intentional manipulation of the globe's climate system. It involves spraying reflective metal particulates into the atmosphere. It also involves radio frequency transmissions like that produced from HARP and several dozen other facilities like HARP. So again, this is not a fight I wanted. I'm not an activist. I'm not politically oriented. But if you can't walk out the door and breathe without inhaling this stuff, I'm faced with a fight. And again, we see how disrupted the weather systems are. Nobody has a right to play God with the weather. And again, forcing all of us to breathe what they are using in these programs, it's literally biological engineering as well.
I think there's something going on that we can't ignore, especially when these particulates are ending up inside our body. And we know that we can be affected by these other technologies, which we'll talk about tonight, like HARP. And so it's not just happening in one area either. Do you think that this is a global phenomenon, or do you see this as something that's just happening in the Western nations?
There's no question it's global. It appears you have the NATO powers on one side of this equation. You have China, Russia on the other. So not only do you have countries attempting to manipulate climate, not attempting to, but completely disrupting climate over their own countries, we also have opposing powers that are literally weather warfare engaged, and this is a tug-of-war with the planet's life support systems. It can't continue. As far as knowing that it's global, yes, we have reports from all over the globe. We have tests from all over the globe. We have one particular study that's very telling. In 2010, Alex, 1,000 whales from around the globe were tested for inorganics, and their tissues showed astounding levels of aluminum. And quite simply, we know this is in the food chain now virtually everywhere. And the human test subjects are, for hair, blood, and urine, are every single time off the charts for levels of the same metals we associate with the geoengineering patents. And we have about 150 of these patents, by the way, listed on our site. So we're not guessing. We know this material's in the air. We have 70 lab tests in Northern California alone at the state-certified lab. We know the human health effect. We see that showing up across the board statistically. In fact, Alex, the latest statistics from MIT, and I'm sure you know who they are, Massachusetts Institute of Technology, on the current trajectory, within 10 years, 1 out of 2 children will have autism. 1 out of 2.
Why do you think that there is so much spraying on the West Coast?
The spraying is actually occurring all over just because a lot of people just look for the horizon-to-horizon trails. And this is where, again, the whole contrail or particulate trail argument comes up. I encourage people to search high bypass turbofan jet engine. And this is where the argument really stops. The type of jet engine that's on all commercial carriers and all military tankers is a high bypass turbofan engine. 85% of the air that passes through that engine is not combusted. That engine is nearly incapable of making any, quote, condensation trail. When you see any trail of any significance behind any large jet aircraft, unless it's a fighter jet, which is a completely different engine, then you're seeing a particulate disbursement. And the amount of material that's coming down on the ground is enough in Northern California, where I'm at, it's changed soil pH values 10 to 12 times toward alkaline in soils that were formerly acidic. So we're talking about an incredible amount of metal coming down on us. We've seen aquatic insect life decline in our region by 90% in the last decade, and that's as measured by a Forest Service biologist. So this is an absolute cataclysm that's unfolding around us right now, and I don't think anyone can argue the weather is about as off as it could get.
And you're right, it is happening everywhere. But I also have noticed quite a few researchers on the subject. In fact, most of them seem to be based in Northern California. So for whatever reason, either you're being affected by it more than other places, or they're starting the spraying in certain locations because, again, I'm just speculating, but I don't know myself. They're following the patterns of the jet stream in order to get to spread out to certain areas where the jet stream is flowing. Is there any information along those lines? Is there a reason why they might be spraying in certain areas?
Well, you're correct. The jet stream is one of the mechanisms where they prefer to seed these particulates. When we have the atmospheric rivers, the AR, coming into the western states, when they allow that to happen, that's a platform on which they aerosolize the heaviest. But there are anti-geoengineering groups around the globe. Many of them, they're cropping up everywhere. And we're not just based in Northern California. There's a particular amount of activity here because we have been working on this issue perhaps the longest, but the groups are everywhere. And on this issue, it's important for your listeners to understand the science terms are very important. Geoengineering, climate engineering, solar radiation management, those are the terms that will gain traction when people search those terms. If you use the chemtrails term, that by design leads to conspiracy theory and hoax. So stick to the science and you'll gain credibility with those you're trying to share this data with.
Yeah, I agree. So there's geoengineering. There's what are some other scientific terms you might want to introduce to us?
Climate engineering, you have solar radiation management, stratospheric aerosol injection. There's a number of terms. Now they're trying to coin the term because too many people are looking at the geoengineering term now and it's starting to raise awareness. They're trying to use the term cloud albedo enhancement. And these terms don't mean anything to a layperson, and that's the intent. That's why geoengineering is a term that's used, because to most people it doesn't sound like anything atmospheric, and that's by design. But the most straightforward term to use is climate engineering. Most people have heard of weather modification. That term is very straightforward. So it's important for people to understand, Alex, why are they doing this? And that's everybody's first question. There's a lot of answers to that question, a great many answers. It all comes down to power and control, ultimately. But these programs have been going on for 6.5 decades in the attempt to exercise that power and control, very historically documented from Project Popeye in Vietnam, a very successful weather mod program over the Ho Chi Minh Trail. Again, a lot of historical documentation, but as this has gone on so long, it's done cataclysmic damage to the climate. The more damage they do, the more they ramp up these programs to try to mitigate that damage. So this is the true definition of insanity. By trying to do the same thing over and over and expecting a different result, it just gets worse and worse. Now we have true global cataclysms unfolding, the methane release in the Arctic, massive ozone depletion. These programs will determine our fate if they continue, Alex.
Are you linking those particular things taking place with the geoengineering or the climate engineering?
Well, all of it. Any weather warfare is part and parcel. You can't separate the two. I mean, any type of engineering of the climate can only be construed as weather warfare.
Okay, we'll be back in a few minutes with our guest, Dane Wigington from geoengineeringwatch.org. I'm Alex Ansary. We'll be back. So, Dane, one thing I might want to give you some time to explain for those that don't know. I was curious myself. Why is your website down?
Well, it's back up now, but somehow something was triggered that overloaded the data by up to 60 gigabytes, which is a profound amount of data in a few hours. And so we're not sure what did it, why it happened. We've had this sort of thing happen before, Alex, when I posted data about a year and a half ago on the extraordinarily high UV radiation levels that we're being exposed to now that's not being reported. The site was down in 15 minutes, went down 8 times in the next 2 days. So we can speculate about that, but this is, again, the sort of control that those in power have. They control social media, that's no secret, and they certainly control mainstream media. And, back to with your listeners, again, why is this issue so important? If there was someone up on our roofs with a sprayer spraying toxic materials down all over our house and yard, and every time we walked out the door we had to breathe it, we would do something about that, wouldn't we? And that's exactly what we have. I mean, the amount of material being put in the atmosphere, even as stated by the world's most recognized geoengineer, David Keith, their goal of 20 million tons of aluminum nanoparticulates, that's an extraordinary amount of material. Mathematically, it's about 1,000 tanker flights a day with 60 to 70 tons of the most microscopic particles imaginable. And the smaller the particle, the more harmful they are to the human organism, saturating the planet 24/7. This is how serious this issue is. And again, it shredded the ozone layers. I just mentioned we have UVB radiation that we know is in the case of UVB, it's about 1,000% higher than we're being told. Now, that might sound astounding to some people, but the meters don't lie, nor do trees. We have the bark being burnt off of trees. This is hugely harmful for us. It's harmful for every form of flora and fauna. And the amount of threat that's being hidden by mainstream media in the power structure right now, Alex, is astounding. And again, if we don't have a life support system on our planet, if we can't breathe without sucking this stuff in, which is affecting our ability to think because we know what aluminum does to the blood-brain barrier, we have a real fight for life on our hands. It's that serious.
And I know people don't want to be labeled a conspiracy theorist, but do you have a strong feeling in your gut why they're really doing this or what the program is really there for? Because on paper, they're trying to say that this is a good, positive thing for the planet. But when you're talking about trees dying, and by the way, I've seen more trees dying here in Portland, a major city that's getting a lot of geoengineering activity, and there may very well be a connection. So I'm wondering what they're really, the other term that I hear others use, terraforming. Well, why are they changing the atmosphere? What kind of world are they really trying to build?
Well, again, this is where the situation becomes complex. First, any form of activity, human activity on our planet, that alters the original ecosystems or biosphere is a form of terraforming. I mean, or geoengineering. So when we put 100 tons of CO2 in the atmosphere every day, that's a problem. Geoengineering is an even bigger problem because geoengineering stops the planet from responding as it otherwise would. So again, why are they doing it? Power and control. It all comes back to power and control. But when you exercise this power over the environment, damage is done. And as I stated earlier, the more damage that's done, the more they ramp these programs up to hide that damage from the public view as long as possible. So now we have, as you know, we have a very cold eastern U.S. Everybody knows that because that's all the media wants them to know. They focus on that again and again and again, the record snow in Boston and so forth. But they're not saying much about the fact that we have no snow in the Sierras, sometimes up 14,000 feet. We have nothing. That the coldest, the most anomalously cold, below normal place on the entire planet through the entire 2014 year, and again starting in this year, is the eastern half of the U.S. Now, people should wonder, how can that be? Because that's what the geoengineers want to cool down, to create the headlines, to create the confusion as to the true state of the climate. While every time they cause one of these cool downs, it makes the overall warming worse. So in spite of record warm oceans, in fact, I'll be posting a video on geoengineeringwatch.org in the next few hours that will outline this in greater detail with the most current GFS and GISS maps to show people clearly with color coding exactly how warm it is and where. And if people look at the bigger picture, Alex, again, the Although there's many aspects of these programs, weather warfare, there appears to be some biological experimentation going on. But one of the biggest issues right now is they're simply trying to hide the gravity of what's unfolding from the public as long as possible while they're digging in, quite literally digging in with underground bunkers. So bottom line, if we can't expose these programs before irreparable damage has been done to our own bodies, to the biosphere, we won't have much left to salvage. It's that simple.
And I've noticed how, there are definitely different programs taking place. Some days there'll be some spraying, and what will take place is a lingering of that haze over the course of several hours. And there may be other days where there's clearly a spraying where it dissipates throughout the whole skies, not like a contrail, but it actually dissipates and creates a haze. But it only hangs around for, say, a half an hour or an hour. So it seems like those may be different programs where some sprays are hanging out longer and some are more less visible.
You're exactly right, and you bring up a very, very good point. Too many people, even people who know about the geoengineering and are fighting it, still associate it only with the horizon-to-horizon trails on an otherwise clear day. That is only a small aspect of the overall programs. In fact, some of the heaviest spraying goes on over existing built-up aerosol canopy where you can't even see them. And these shorter, bright trails that people see that they mistake for, quote, condensation trails, still a particulate disbursement. Again, you shouldn't see anything behind these commercial aircraft or military tankers unless you live in the farthest north regions and the aircraft is at the highest altitudes. You shouldn't see anything. And that's the type of spraying we see where the atmosphere becomes a silvery white, like you described, and the particulates are absolutely there. And I encourage people on those days, go outside with a bright light, aim it up, and see what you see. Yes, there's particulates in the atmosphere all the time to some degree. It's 10 times worse when they're spraying. If you go outside with a bright light on a dark night after heavy spraying, it looks like it's snowing. And we're breathing all this stuff in. And when we see people testing for aluminum and barium, strontium, Alex, we see them showing up with 10, 12, 15 times more than the top end of the scale. I mean, people are absolutely saturated with these metals. And if we look back again at the autism, to consider we've gone from 1 in 5,075 to 1 in 47 in 2014, and now we're being told it's going to be 1 in 2. And that doesn't mean that the child that's not diagnosed is not, that child is healthy. They can't be healthy because they're exposed to the same elements. They're simply not to a full-blown diagnosis yet. So this is an all-out assault, and the gravity of it can't be overstated. Short of thermonuclear catastrophe, this is the greatest and most immediate threat we face, and we desperately need people to join us in the effort to expose these programs.
Okay, so is there a place, like a newsletter sign up on your website or other ways people can get involved?
There is. There's a mail list at geoengineeringwatch.org. There are also, on the upper left corner, there's activist suggestions to tell people what to do, because people can do a tremendous amount from their own home. If we have also a link called Flaming Arrows near the activist suggestions link. That's a pre-prepared data package so that people in any given area from their own home computer can find groups in their area. Alzheimer's, autism, some of these sports or outdoors groups. The list is really endless. Farmers, ag, send them a heads up. Plead with them to investigate these programs, and so that they understand they're being affected with this. And it's important to consider also that groups like, for example, the Alzheimer's group that we always would assume is trying to fight Alzheimer's, it's quite dark in some of these circles. In fact, I tried to sponsor a booth at the major Alzheimer's event in Northern California. I tried to pay $500 to sponsor a booth. They refused my sponsorship because, one, they didn't want me talking about any connection between aluminum and Alzheimer's, which they do not recognize any such connection, in spite of the fact that there's peer-reviewed science studies that prove that connection. Most average citizens recognize and know that there's a connection. And two, they did not want me talking about the fact that there's a massive aluminum contamination globally that's falling out of our skies. So they refused my sponsorship of their event, and our subsequent research showed that there are members from the aluminum industry sitting on Alzheimer's boards. What a surprise.
You know, I've noticed on days where there's heavy spraying, where it's lingering in the air for several hours, the way people, the driving, and people looking really distracted, like they're not really paying attention, like it's taking them longer to think as they try to drive. And I know, some people are distracted naturally with their cell phones and, being inconsiderate of the person behind them. Oh, look at that. But it really seems like on those heavy spray days that there's more accidents and more people that are somewhat disoriented. And, in these major cities today, now we're living with so many technologies that we weren't living alongside decades ago or hundreds of years ago, but just 10 years ago. So you look at smart meters, and we look at radio waves and cell phone towers and geoengineering. I highly suspect, even if we don't have all the facts now in front of us, because there are so many programs, there's ones they tell us about and there's the ones that they don't tell us about. There's the publicly available patents, which we'll talk about today in greater detail. And then there's the stuff that we'll never know about, like how it all interacts with technology and our bodies basically being zapped with these particulates inside of us.
Your points are exactly on target. There are so many assaults coming at us right now from so many different directions. Because of the absorption of these particulates, our bodies are more conductive. The atmosphere is more conductive as well, and that's part of these programs, one of the intent. Atmospheric conductivity over the U.S. has been measured as much as 400% higher than the historical norm. This has to be the case when you have conductive particulates being sprayed. But our bodies are more conductive, so these RF frequencies, they're coming from every direction, from all the cell phone use, from the ionosphere heaters, again, the HARP-type facilities. That's part of the weather modification programs. These are extremely powerful radio frequency transmitters. We are being bombarded, and each one of these elements is harmful in and of themselves. And as you correctly stated, when you combine all this, it's an all-out assault. It's a wonder any of us can think, walk, or do anything at this point. It can't continue. This is where we need people to turn off the football games, forget about American Idol, and get in the fight for the common good, or your reality will not be the same much longer. At best right now, we're in free fall to a new reality. But if we don't join together in the fight for the common good, if we can't stop the current onslaught against life on Earth, starting with climate engineering, we'll have nothing left to salvage. And I mean not a century off or a few decades off. It's here now. We're in the sixth great mass extinction now, today. We have, as of last week, we had 1,500 sea lions washed up on the beaches of Southern California. At least they're dead. At least there was something to wash up. I did a survey along the Northern California coast a month plus ago. We couldn't find a single seal, not one. So again, people have no idea what's happening around them because they're not being told. And the gravity of what's unfolding, it can't be overstated. We're losing 200 species of plant and animal a day to extinction, Alex.
More and more of these stories I'm seeing in the paper, and it's overwhelming when one doesn't necessarily know whether it's caused by the geoengineering or caused by those birds or fish losing their way, if you will, with changes in our magnetic field and magnetic north moving. And so that is a possibility some people have raised, that they're ending up in colder airs or pockets of air or waters, and they're ending up dead. But it could very well be directly linked to geoengineering. All I know is every year we're seeing more and more of these reports, and there's never any answers. And there was recently a whole bunch of ash that I think came down over Spokane and parts of eastern Washington. And there weren't really any clear answers on that as well, as to where they came from. Some media reports were saying, well, maybe it's from the volcanic eruption in Russia or Japan. And then there were other reports linking it to other things. Do you think that there's something out of the ordinary with the ash that was seen in Spokane?
Absolutely. To back up a little bit, everything you said is on target. Everything. With the birds falling out of the skies, the connection to the RF frequency, there is a global polarization issue going on right now as well, but it's all the above. And when something happens like what just happened in Washington, yes, there's something behind that, and we are not being told. That's the official role of agencies that are supposedly there for the public good. Their role is to pacify the public, to downplay the severity of everything that's unfolding. I know this firsthand. I've been in high-level EPA meetings in Sacramento. I've met with the lieutenant governor. I've been in Barbara Boxer's office. I've met with Congressman Doug LaMalfa. This is something I've been at nonstop for 10 plus years. The whole system is designed to hide the truth, to hide what's happening. So when they start talking about a volcano being the source of this milky rain, the wind currents did not bear out that possibility. So who knows what they're spraying at any given point in time. We also have filaments coming down. And in this case, in one instance...
Oh, we'll pick it up on the other side. And we will get into that as well as many other things, including where all this started. I've heard a lot of things about the 1950s, this agreement between Russia and China. So if that's true, it shows us evidence of these superstates collaborating in this global conspiracy, if you will, to poison the population. And that raises even more questions about what's going on. Now, thinking back to the first time that I think I saw, evidence of geoengineering, it was the mid-'80s. And I don't know how many programs were going on then, but I remember being a kid then in the first grade at the age of 6, and for the first time wondering what was that I was seeing up in the skies above me. Maybe I really was just looking at a jet, and I was fascinated by it, but I thought there was something strange. It was the mid-'80s. And I don't know how many programs were going on then, but I remember being a kid then in the first grade at the age of 6, and for the first time wondering what was that I was seeing up in the skies above me about that trail. So what facts are available, Dane, in terms of when all this really began? Is it the 1950s and that agreement between Russia and China, and what is that anyways? Or did it even start even before that?
We know the programs went on at a significant scale going back to the late 40s, and the biggest indicator we have of just how significant a scale they were on even then, global mean temperatures rose more or less linearly since 1850, the start of the Industrial Revolution. At the late 40s, they took an extremely anomalous leveling off and even dipped slightly up to the 70s. Now, this was extremely perplexing to the climate science community that did not know these programs were going on. They should have known, just like the climate science community today pretends not to know. They can't not know, but they don't speak publicly about it for fear of losing their paychecks and pensions, apparently. But that dip showed just how much effect the early deployment of these programs had, so that by the 70s, we had about a fourth of the meteorological community thinking that perhaps there was some major factor they didn't know about, and there was, and they were speculating perhaps an ice age was coming because they couldn't figure out why the planet was cooling. Again, the earlier deployment of these programs had a much greater effect than now because many negative feedback mechanisms have been triggered, so they're having to spray more and more and more, and it's only making everything worse. But the involvement of other major governments was certainly there, and we know there was collusion. We know that because I found pictures from 1968 of Soviet weather modification scientists touring U.S. weather modification facilities, and there has to be collusion, obviously, or each government would be telling on the other one, but they all cover each other on this particular issue. And that's one of the reasons is, again, back to the methane that's expelling from the Arctic. I encourage people to search Arctic methane emergency and keep in mind that although the emergency is real, climate engineering, which at some point the government may sell to us openly as a mitigation for this, has actually helped to cause it. So you can't fix something with the same mechanism that helped to cause it. People need to understand this, but the methane situation is real, and the governments are still colluding in their attempt to try to cover that up and hide it from the population as long as possible. So it's a very convoluted situation, Alex, but all is in the balance. All is in the balance in these programs.
What do you think is happening with the planet, with the climate that's naturally based, that has nothing to do with geoengineering? And do you think that they're trying to alter what's taking place, stop what's taking place, make it warmer? It sounds like you're suggesting that they're trying to obviously make it warmer because of the reality of what the impact really is.
They're trying to, at this point, they're trying to hide it. Again, the climate engineering is sold as a way to turn the thermostat down, but that is not true. We have enough data now, more than enough. We have 6.5 decades of this to know it has only harmed. Yes, they can cool huge regions radically. They can put very cold layers on the ground, very shallow layers, but cold layers on the ground. That's exactly what they're doing in the eastern U.S. And I don't know if any of your listeners have noticed, but the Weather Channel will try very hard to explain why it's frozen in the ground, but yet the freezing temperatures don't start again to 5,500, 6,000 feet. Now, why is that? Because, again, when they ice nucleate clouds, and we know they're doing this, we can see it on the radar. Chinese government openly announced they were doing it. Anybody can search this. The cold air is dense. It falls straight to the ground. It's like the freezer, open freezer section in your market where the cold air sits in there. It creates a very low temperature reading on the ground, but it's only a layer in the ground. And that's how they're confusing the population. So in regard to the overall climate, again, I know we all hate Al Gore. I don't like Al Gore either. I'm not a carbon credits fan. But the bottom line is we have to look at reality. A lot of damage has been done to the planet. Climate engineering is one of the single greatest sources of that damage. And the bottom line is now they're simply trying to cover it up, Alex. Just like an example I often use is the Corexit chemical in the Gulf of Mexico. For your listeners that don't know what that was, it's a highly toxic chemical banned throughout the globe. They used it in the Gulf of Mexico to hide the oil spill. It helped the oil sink, made the situation exponentially more toxic. But the power structure doesn't care. It helped to hide the problem. And that's where we're at right now. So while they're creating records and all the theater on Weather Channel and Winter Storm Pandora and Winter Storm Remus and all these theatrical names, it's purely theater. They don't talk about the record warm temperatures all around the globe. And I mean off the scale. We have temperatures in the Arctic Ocean. In fact, 2 days ago, it was warmer in the Arctic Circle than it was in Texas. And anybody who thinks that's normal needs to rethink their reality. So we had ocean temperatures in the Arctic in Slavobod that were 34 degrees above normal. This is a cataclysm. It's unfolding. It's thawing methane on the seafloor. The methane's releasing. Again, you can only get a bad result when you try to play God with Earth's primary life support systems.
And another thing, we don't see world leaders calling out other world leaders on this issue and talking about weather warfare. We see chest pounding. We see what appears to be the ramp up to World War III, potential event in the next decade that I think could be staged. But that aside, we see a lot of focus. So Putin versus Obama on Ukraine and all these other issues, these periodic skirmishes between China and the United States and other navies in the South China Sea and in the Indian Ocean. But if they're working together to cover up this global climate change geoengineering program, then there's something else going on. If they've reached some sort of agreement, there's a lot of people out there who have seen some of these things like Fukushima and have said that there is evidence of HAARP being used. I'll also say there was a massive X-class solar flare prior to Fukushima. So they may be using and harnessing the natural power of the sun and other things, storms, and redirecting them. But that aside, if they really are using these technologies to create earthquakes in Haiti and other places in China, then these world governments are colluding together to allow this to happen to their people. And if that's the case, then our current understanding of how this new world order is set up is not as up to par to where it needs to be. And I think that there might be something more going on with this collusion. And some of the things that we're seeing now might very well be staged, meant to look like it's real. You know, Putin says this about Obama. Obama says this about Putin. But in reality, the global geoengineering program just goes on another day.
You bring up many good points, and I would say I'm on the same page with you all the way around. In regard to the climate engineering itself, there's three major players, China, Russia, and the U.S. There's other smaller players, but those are the three major ones. We do have world leaders on the floor of the UN stating the NATO alliance is droughting out their country. Ahmadinejad been on the floor of the UN twice.
Right.
The Iranian vice president twice, stating that their country was being droughted out by the NATO weather modification programs. And every country that NATO has invaded, Libya, Iraq, Syria, everyone they disrupt is undergoing record drought. The countries in Africa that have been going through record drought, which shouldn't happen with a warming world. You would have some fluctuation in drought in some areas, but overall you have 7% more moisture with every degree of warming. It should be raining more, not less. It's been used as a tool for decades to bring a country to its knees, put U.S. boots on the ground, occupy, force the country to comply. Back to Fukushima now. What happened there? Isn't Japan an ally of the U.S.? Well, not necessarily. Japan was starting to ally with its regional partners just prior to that quake. And when we have institutions like MIT stating on the record, they studied the fact that the atmosphere directly above the epicenter very anomalously heated for days prior to that quake. That's a very big red flag. That there was, in fact, ionosphere heaters used to help trigger that quake. And those who think that this is not possible, you simply have not done your research. When you beam billions of watts into the planet of the correct frequency, it causes vibrations. And in a seismically sensitive zone, it is already proven to be able to cause seismic activity. Now, we can't prove that quake was caused by this, but I will say this. There's a lot of people who know I'm in this area of research. I was called 3 days prior to that quake by a person who lives on the California coast in a tsunami zone. Her relative is in Army intelligence. She asked me if I knew of any reason she should be away from the coast because she was called by her relative and told to be away that Friday. I didn't think twice about it. You hear things like this all the time. You can imagine I was shocked to turn the TV on that Friday morning and see the quake had happened. So, again, it's still not proof. We have too many dots that connect, too many instances where a country that was starting to get out of line suddenly has a catastrophe, and a catastrophe that we know that can be linked to this technology. So in regard to these three major players covering each other on this issue, I think it comes down to this. If their own populations knew what was going on in the skies above them, they would risk their own security as far as their power goes. And they're simply trying to cover each other to some degree in that regard at this time. But I don't think that's going to last much longer, Alex. I think we're much closer to cataclysm than most want to accept. And I think global conflict, as you correctly stated, is much closer than 10 years. And there's a lot of theater going on in that regard. I agree.
And another thing about Japan, I believe they wanted the U.S. to leave their base in Okinawa right before that time, and there were measures and proposals and talks and protests. But, yeah, very interesting. Dane Wigington from GeoEngineeringWatch.org is our guest. We'll be back after this. Bring you today's report on geoengineering, the terraforming of the Earth, with our guest Dane Wigington of Northern California. I'm looking over at geoengineering as a search term under Google News at the moment, and people might want to check this out. There's a number of stories that are out in the last 24 hours. We just set this interview up like at the last minute a couple days ago. Here's one from environmentalresearchweb.org. Geoengineering schemes to combat climate change still risky, says reports. Dramatic reductions in the emissions of greenhouse gases are essential to help mitigate the effects of climate change, according to two reports issued this month by the National Research Council of the U.S. Academy of Sciences. Written by a 22-strong committee, the report argues that removing carbon dioxide from the atmosphere is the most promising approach to tackle climate change, but conclude that the use of geoengineering to reduce the amount of solar energy that reduces the atmosphere is too risky. That type of geoengineering, the report states, should instead be restricted to small-scale experiments rather than full deployment. Have you noticed this, Dane, in the last day or so, couple days, all these reports are coming out?
It's actually not just the last couple days. In fact, I'm going to email you now.
Yeah, it's more like maybe the last couple weeks.
That's correct. And I'll email you now. In one day, we had about 24 mainstream articles cover this issue because the elephant in the room is getting very difficult to hide, and they know it. So on February 10th and 11th, we had 2 to 3 dozen mainstream articles surface on this issue. And on the 11th, we had the Arctic Methane Emergency Group, the frontline Arctic scientists, go on the record as if in tandem with this effort to put out the data on geoengineering, stating if we do not geoengineer immediately, we have no chance. Now, this is not a coincidence that these two statements or this barrage of media and then the statement come out so close together. So, again, we have the entire climate science community right now is completely illegitimate for the fact that they are not mentioning the single greatest factor in climate disruption of all. Not the only one. I want to stress that as well. 100 million tons of CO2 in the atmosphere every day, huge problem. Cutting down the forests around the globe, huge problem. Paving the planet, huge problem. But climate engineering is stopping the planet from responding to any of that as best as it could. So when we have a whole climate science community, tens of thousands of scientists literally, who will not talk about this issue, and we can put them in three categories, and I often do. They're either blind, they feel threatened, or they're just simply lying to protect their paycheck and pension. And you can pick from the three. But this is the biggest story on the planet. If we could break this story, everyone on the planet would know they have been harmed. Everyone has been harmed from this. In fact, irreparably harmed. So as per a conversation I had with a man named Jim Phelps, who's a architect of these programs, and I kept his name anonymous for a long time until someone else leaked it. But I publicized conversations I had with Mr. Phelps. They're very interesting. I think your readers would find them extremely interesting. Dialogue with the GeoEngineering Insider. They can look at both of these conversations. But he stated, and this is important to remember why they're hiding these programs, he said if the public found out, they would seek out those responsible and hang them or shoot them in front of a firing squad. They know the public will never tolerate being lab rats in this massive lethal test, and they will hide it as long as they possibly can. It's up to us to expose it.
And if people can be conditioned to kind of accept the absurd and consider this normal, I mean, that's like a psychological conditioning process in and of itself that, could be psychoanalyzed. And we're going, it almost seems, into some sort of a robotic world. This combined with transhumanism and other things that go in different directions outside the scope of what we're talking about tonight. But it interrelates. It definitely interrelates when they talk about the new man and their goal for 2045. Scientists talking about their goal in big publications as they put out these memes, as they give us the virtual reality headsets, as more and more people are being lost in their cell phones in the land of the LCD screen. I also want to mention another headline. This is from Bloomberg. I mean, you don't get much more mainstream than that. GeoEngineering is good insurance. And the date for this, I believe, was the 8th of February. So these are pretty bold headlines. I would say that it's probably time for someone to go out and make a documentary film on the topic. I know one's already been made, but I'm not going to knock it. Someone could even get more in-depth with all the current information. I'd say to anyone listening, this is a good time to really launch into this issue if someone wants to get involved and start sharing the information. And I also want to let people know that on this second day launch of AFR, we've got the phones working. So we've got the phone line open at 218-339-8525 if you're listening on this February 26th, 2015 transmission. That's 1-218-339-8525. But, yeah, hopefully we can reach more people, Dane, with these mainstream admissions. But first people were denying it. Then they were silent. And now we're going to see all these people that think that they're green-friendly say that they're for this. I'll tell you that there's a mayor in Portland, former mayor, Sam Adams. And when he was the mayor, he was pushing a lot of Agenda 21 policies. And they were talking about smart growth. And now we've got all these smart meters. And I don't know how much you know about Portland, but it's quickly become the most gentrified city in all of North America. So there's a lot of social engineering here and a lot of politicians that I guess are helping mold the city to put it into a certain direction. And now former Mayor Adams, is going to work for a climate change initiative in Washington, D.C. So it's interesting to see some of these people get promoted up the ladder in Washington.
That's the way it works. If you toe the line for the power structure, the criminal cabal that runs the world, you get moved up the ladder. That's exactly how it works. How many examples of that do we need to see? Backing up a little bit, you said people are becoming conditioned. Again, you're right. You're exactly right. Most people do not recognize the difference between a real cloud, a natural cloud, and an aerosol cloud. They don't recognize the difference, and they're very easy to recognize the difference. Aerosol clouds are dirty, fuzzy, cobweb-like looking clouds, and there's such a mix. It's not either this or that. some days you have solid aerosol skies where the trails are very visible, but on many days it's just a big mix. And we don't see the sun beaming through the storm systems anymore whenever there's a break in the clouds, because above those clouds is a massive aerosol canopy. So the majority of the population, because this has come on over so many decades, being ramped up all the time, they don't recognize what an aerosol cloud is. Even a sky that's nothing but aerosol clouds, dirty, dingy, toxic-looking sky, featureless, you don't have the bright white clouds in the blue sky, they don't even recognize it anymore. So, and they don't recognize that their health is deteriorating, and that the fact that they have to clear their lungs and their throat out all the time now. This is the frogs in boiling water, if you will. So, again, if we look at society as a whole right now, Alex, it is nothing but a mass delusion that this current paradigm can continue. It's a snake eating its own tail. And if science was really, quote, science, why would they build 80 of the world's top 100 habitations at sea level when they know there's 240 feet of sea level rise guaranteed when the ice melts? And it is melting, by the way. In fact, anybody who Googles some of the sea level rise on the East Coast has happened in the last few years at a much faster pace than was forecast, having flooding problems in places in southern Florida now every time there's a high tide. This is no joke, and it's happening at a much faster rate. So, again, if we look at the whole paradigm and what, quote, science has brought us, what the PhDs have brought us, the science is very misperceived by people, and they think that the, quote, experts know it all. How many examples do we need to see with medicine and vaccinations and nuclear power? We have the experts telling us it's safe. Really? Fukushima could kill us all. And we have Obama approving billions of dollars for new plants in Georgia now, as if we don't have enough nuclear problems already. It's a circus of insanity, Alex.
Okay, you mentioned Fukushima. What do you think is the real radiation threat or levels that we're facing? You know, there's some websites that sound a little alarmist, but we all have to be realistic. We have to be realistic about what we're looking at and what we're experiencing and what's in our bodies. So where do you think the radiation levels are on the West Coast, be it Oregon, California, Washington, and do you think there's a higher concentration on the West Coast than, say, the Midwest or the East Coast?
There appears to be. We've measured here with our own meters and seen at times 300-400 CPM, and that's about 6 or 7 times higher than we should see. The problem with Fukushima is we have 3 reactors there in China syndrome. They're through their containment vessel. There's no end in sight. And this is what the media is not disclosing. And now we just learned a few hours ago that there was massive leaks 10 months ago that TEPCO did not disclose. The fishermen in Japan are just now finding out about it. And so, yes, we see a lot of the marine die-off on the North American West Coast is a cataclysm happening right now. Many causes, though. Some people want to blame it all on Fukushima. That's not true. Fukushima is a huge part of the problem, but it's certainly not the only part. We know we have the bottom of the food chain dropping out. We know back to all the damage we've done to the oceans. I think most of your listeners are aware of a lot of that. But we also have a decimated ozone layer, much higher UV radiation. That kills plankton. We know plankton populations globally are down 50 to 60%. That's the bottom line pillar of the food chain on the planet Earth. So there's no food. We have gassing occurring now, seafloor gassing, because the oceans are warming so rapidly. You have, in fact, Alex, you probably remember the smelly air that came into Seattle in early January that smelled like rotten eggs for a number of days. Do you remember that? I don't know if you saw it.
I didn't catch that story, but there's more and more stories coming out about air pollution from China that's coming our way.
Well, this is different in this case. Certainly there's issues with what China's doing, but in this case, that had the hallmark of seafloor gassing where you have methane and hydrogen sulfide. Hydrogen sulfide is heavier than air, so it sits on the surface, and we know the atmospheric methane count is going through the roof. We know the seafloors are gassing. So if we have hydrogen sulfide now starting to drift into certain coastal areas, and the same reports happened in California, in Arcata, we heard from a lot of people this smell was coming in. Of course, the authorities try to deny it. But when these seafloor gassings occur, Alex, I'm sure you've seen the massive fish die-offs in areas where the whole surface just is littered with dead fish. And that's indicative of these gassings as well, because it deoxygenates the water. So you have anoxic and hypoxic zones created. Authorities claim not to know what that's about either. So we have a lot of things unfolding, none of them good. Media trying to hide it from the population because that's what they're paid to do. People better wake up fast.
No, if we're being bombarded with this stuff and we're living in environments where it's happening on a daily basis or on a weekly basis, there's only so much cleaning we can do of our system. I'm just being realistic. But there are certain things that can be done to mitigate some of the harmful effects of being poisoned. And, I could throw out a few things that I think are helpful. They can at least boost one's morale if they live in a healthy lifestyle. Obviously, I could just talk on a basic level. And I go off and on cigarettes, but obviously smoking quite a bit in a heavy geoengineering environment, probably not the best idea. There's things I've researched like coconut oil pulling. It can really pull the toxins, and it's done through the mouth. And this whole practice of oil pulling goes back thousands of years to ancient India. So I think like something like that can also be applied to a healthy lifestyle. I would also add in things like oil of oregano and olive leaf extract. Then more people are getting involved in colloidal silver and doing it properly themselves. Do you agree that some of these things are useful, and do you have, other tips that you may want to share?
I think your assessment of that was very grounded. It's right on target. Yes, there's a certain amount we can do, but at the same time, we have to stop the constant exposure, or all the mitigation won't matter because it will continue to bioaccumulate. But oil pulling does seem to have merit. Chelation, if it's done properly, has merit. I'm
not seeing a whole lot of ways how we can stop it currently. Again, back to it seems like that's why some people have difficulty even approaching the issues, because it's so obvious, in our face, and the way that some of us are treated when we approach people with this information. How do we stop it when most of society seems to resent the messenger?
Well, your point is absolutely valid, and you know that I've gone through an unimaginable amount of that in the last 12 years of fighting this battle. But here's what's different about this issue. The cataclysms that are unfolding are picking up momentum so rapidly, there'll be no hiding this for much longer. So no matter how hard the power structure tries to suppress anyone who attempts to speak out about this, people are hearing about it. Even if they're still skeptical, they're hearing about it. And the seeds are being planted everywhere. And I would argue, again, those seeds will be forced to sprout soon as the climate system begins to completely blow apart. And it is beginning to blow apart. So this issue, unlike any other that they can sweep under the rug, this one won't fit under the rug. And as more of the climate science community realizes, and I know some of these people, that the ship is going down, their paychecks and their pensions are not going to matter. At some point, when they know they have enough cover, they will pour from every crack and corner, Alex. And if the population would just simply not become discouraged, your listeners would help us to sound the alarm, start spot fires everywhere where the media can't put it out. Wherever you live, your circle of friends, wake them up. Again, the equation I use often, if one person wakes up to the first day of a 30-day month, those two each the second day, that's 5.5 million at the end of 30 days. We can make this exponential. We could bring this to light. But pass on, this is key. This is very key. Pass on credible data. Don't just start ranting without something to give, to pass on, something for a person you're trying to wake up to read, to look at, to digest. If you try to ram the whole oak tree down people's throats, they'll gag it back up. It won't fit. You have to plant the seed, walk away, let it grow with credible data.
Right. So using scientific terms, climate engineering, geoengineering, terraforming, and maybe citing some patents. What patents do you think are the most important ones to cite?
Well, there's a long list of patents. The Welsbach patent from 1991 signed to Hughes Aircraft. That seems to be a key patent. But there's a whole list on our site. Mm-hmm. And the thing is, we like business cards, for example, or not a business card, but a small informational card that's a business card size. We'll have that posted on GeoEngineering Watch in the next day or two. We just got 20,000 of those printed to pass it out. You can download this for free from GeoEngineering Watch. If you find the right site to print it, they're about a penny a piece for a high-quality, color, glossy, two-sided informational card. For a penny, you can pass on to somebody without wasting a lot of breath, a card.
Okay. Yeah, we'll be back and get more information on the things that people can share, because no doubt there are people that definitely want to share the message and drop pamphlets around. Who knows who may accidentally pick it up and start reading it, left at a coffee shop or somewhere else. I'm Alex Ansary. This is Outside the Box on the all-new American Freedom Radio. We were talking about in relation to conflict zones and geoengineering programs is interesting because we can look at the drought problem in Afghanistan, which is nothing new. But we could say it's been a conflict zone for a while, and the Russians invaded in 1979. Of course, I'm just speculating, but we've seen Russia obviously has this technology and has for many, many decades. And it's possible they've been using it in certain countries that they've invaded over the years to weaken populations. And the other thing, which is a completely different issue, I'm seeing a lot of people moving here from Northern California, and other places, and we were seeing more reports about these droughts or the drought problem in California. A lot of concern as to where it's going to go. And people's wells are going to run dry in certain areas. The United Nations came out with a report last year saying that in 50 years or so many odd years, there's going to be a scorched earth, a scorched North America with only so many places to go where we'll be safe. Yeah, and there'll be water. One of those places mentioned is Portland, Oregon. So for a lot of different reasons, plus the TV show Portlandia, there's this big focus on a lot of people moving here and living in micro apartments, and I'm sure you've heard maybe the stories of the homeless numbers exploding here as they get forced out of California and other areas. It's a city where a lot of things are happening, but to look at the potential of geoengineering influencing some of the moves is kind of almost overwhelming. That's like, this is very involved then when it's influencing mass migration patterns of people.
And it is. You're exactly right. Now, the situation in California right now, whatever a person wants to speculate on as to the motivation or motivations, there is no question the drought in California is a direct result of climate engineering. Again, in a few hours, I'll be posting another video to highlight this, showing the satellite image loops of moisture moving across the Pacific from west to east. It looks like it's hitting a wall off the California coast. It splits and goes two directions. This is the, quote, ridiculously resilient ridge that the meteorologists just can't seem to figure out what's causing it. Well, we know what's causing it. We have blanket aerosol spraying visible in satellite imagery, which helps enhance the ionosphere heater signals. They can create high-pressure zones. They are creating high-pressure zones. This is part of how they're cooling the eastern U.S. Again, some people want to consider California just a target zone. The climatologists, if they were to answer honestly, they would consider it a sacrifice zone, that they're having to sacrifice the West Coast to cool the East Coast. In reality, it's probably both of those scenarios. There's certainly a power in manipulating the food supply in California, and also the high-pressure zone has pushed the jet stream moisture up through Alaska, a lot of warm temperatures in the Arctic, as I mentioned, and it pushes back south where they're able to cool the eastern half of the U.S. and really confuse a lot of people as to the true state of the climate in the U.S. But the bottom line, the drought in California is engineered. There's no question about that. There's no question about the fact that officials know. As I mentioned earlier, I was in Lieutenant Governor Gavin Newsom's office in February of last year, and the data I presented, satellite imagery, was inarguable. He and his aide conceded that this had to be going on. Have they done anything? Absolutely not. Absolutely not. They are shut down if they try to do anything, and not that they have the spine to do it anyway. So everybody's pretending that this isn't going on while the whole ship is sinking by the day. And the amount of metal, Alex, as the last 10 years or 12 years have evolved for me in this fight, there were various stages where after a heavy spray day on one of the ponds I have, it was like a film of like a crust, silvery, shimmery crust. And in your mind, you're thinking, this can't be aluminum. It can't be that bad. There can't be that much metal falling on us. But there is. And I tested. Every time a situation like that would happen, I would test it. And astounding results. In fact, the amount of metal from my baseline test of 7 parts per billion, it later escalated as much as nearly 50,000% to 3,450 parts per billion. So while agencies and academia are pretending this isn't happening, our time frame is very short. You mentioned certain scenarios by 2040 or 2050. We do not have that long. Mathematically speaking, on the current trajectory, our equation is so nonlinear that right now, mathematically, from the best frontline scientists that are speaking honestly on the severity of our situation, we're looking at no life left in the northern hemisphere by 2030 or sooner. That's how short our time horizon is. And people can roll their eyes and walk away at that. They won't be laughing for long. That's how bad it is. In the last 10 years in my area, we've seen a total crash of the forest ecosystem in 10 years, from thriving to virtually silent and dying everywhere, and it's accelerating by the day.
In 2013, I was living in the San Luis Valley of South Central Colorado in a yurt, pretty much off the grid, for about a year, even out there. And that's 5 hours at least south of Denver, so just north of the border of New Mexico. I saw a fair amount of geoengineering there as well. Now, I'm not sure how high they were atmospherically, but, you know, it's kind of course, they do military drills over there, so it's possible they've been doing some testing. Do you think there's any place in America where it's kind of less intense to maybe migrate to? Or do you think that's not even possible at this point? There aren't very many places that I know of or can think of where there's very little geoengineering taking place.
There isn't. You're correct. And when we hear from people who say it's not happening over their area, they just simply don't recognize it. Because even though a lot of the spraying that occurs over Northern California, you know, certainly we get a lot of it here because the moisture sometimes moves across us, but whatever sprayed above us settles somewhere much further to the east. So the stuff's blowing all around the planet. In fact, we have global dimming now, a term that your listeners might not be familiar with. They can search that term. Is 20 to 25%, depending on the study. Global dimming means the amount of direct rays from the sun that no longer reach the surface. There's a lot of sources of this light deflecting material, aerosols from industrial activity, coal generation, and so forth. But the mathematically largest source of these particulates appears to be by far climate engineering. That's the goal, to block the sun with reflective metal particulates. So it's bad everywhere. There's no hiding from this. We have, even in the Arctic, people might think it's, you know, clean somewhere. Some of the first studies we saw from Stanford were of the Arctic haze in the 50s. We know that this is where they had the first profound effect in the Arctic. They were geoengineering over the poles since the 50s. In fact, in the ozone hole over Antarctica, Alex, we have enough data to say that that's the largest source of the ozone depletion is not CFCs, not the hairspray cans, as we were told, but the constant tanker disbursements of these particulates. And anybody would think, let's think about that. What seems more likely? Countless jet tankers dumping millions of tons of toxic particulates in the atmosphere. Would that be the greatest single source of ozone depletion, or some hairspray cans in the ground? I'll let you figure that one out. I mean, we've been lied to a degree that can barely be comprehended.
Okay, so what I think can clearly be seen is that this global grid is being built, and there are many nations that are involved in either participating in this program or saying nothing about the program. You mentioned Iran, but there are very little other exceptions. So let's list some of the main nations. You know, we could start with China, the United States. There's even reports of geoengineering in the Czech Republic. I'm sure these days in Ukraine there's probably quite a bit going on, certainly Russia, the UK. What are some of the other nations that we might want to mention that may be spearheads in technologies relating to geoengineering or just use or application?
I think historically with the technology, the two lead nations appear to be China and Russia. USA and Russia. And the U.S., again, we know the involvement was there. People Google 1966 government document geoengineering. They'll find an 80-page document that I found in the NASA archives that didn't seem to be there one day and was there the next, so maybe we were meant to find it. But that outlines the scope and scale of the programs as of 1966 with budgets in the hundreds of millions of dollars. So there's no question it's been going on for that long on a huge scale. And we know it went back to the late 40s. On the collusion end, again, you have these satellite countries that are just simply along for the ride. In fact, there was some data that indicated Ireland might have been pushing back against these programs, and then suddenly Ireland found it in the midst of economic total collapse. Mexico, we had some reports from people we know there that indicated the government was pushing back, and suddenly the whole swine flu thing happened in Mexico, and then the spraying started again afterwards. So there are so many things going on behind the curtain, Alex, as you correctly stated earlier, that it's hard to know who's pulling what lever and for what reason. But the bottom line is we are in the fast track to total global extinction. And people, again, they're living in a delusion just because they can still go to Walmart and McDonald's and grab a bag of chips and guacamole. This reality is ending by the day, and those who don't believe it will soon. So the bottom line is if we can work together, towards salvaging something of Earth's life support systems, we have to act quickly. We have to expose these programs. And I would argue, again, if we could, a lot of other things would come to the surface. 9/11, for example, how blatant and glaring, not to change the subject, but when you have, most people don't even know there was a third building that collapsed. I talked to two yesterday, intelligent guys. They know that there's a lot of government going on that they're not being told about. But they, like a lot of people, had no idea a third building collapsed at free fall speed. That's how readily the media can hide what's happening. So back to the trails in our sky, if we have the Weather Channel and so forth all pretending the completely engineered and unnatural is natural, people want to believe that because they want to believe there's nothing wrong. But if they stay in that delusion much longer, we're going to have nothing left to say.
And also on that note, with 9/11, it resulted in the deaths of millions of people in the Middle East. And today we are seeing people hypnotized by reports of ISIS, yet there are other reports talking about how a lot of these videos are staged. And so there's a lot of ways people are being distracted to, be afraid of this boogeyman called ISIS and all these other manufactured terror cells. And the most ridiculous stories are now in our news. Western women want to date ISIS. And then I'm watching the comment section. This propaganda is actually sticking with some aspects of what we might call the truth movement, because even they now are boxed in or being told, now you've got to hate this common enemy, and it's the invading brown Muslim. Maybe in a chemtrail society, mind control has been found to be more effective. I don't know. But what I can tell you is we're seeing a lot more reports of people buying the propaganda, being susceptible to this influence. And going back to this conversation about the grid, kind of like the grid from the movie Tron, we're being put into this grid, and we've documented now that it's global. And we're not jumping to conclusions here, but just looking at what is technologically possible here. This grid can be influenced with technology. Now, where that technology may be coming from, it could be on Earth, or it could technologically be possible to be located outside of Earth and be affected by a ray. Now, I'm not going to go jump and start quoting things from certain books and saying this is how it is, but we know that it's technologically possible now that this grid is around the Earth. Things like global mind control or global interference of our energy waves or global interference of the natural Earth patterns, which really impacts us, our emotional states, our energy bodies. It's big. And you mentioned 2030. There's a lot of potential for the year 2025 to see resource wars, as government documents have already shown. So, yeah, it's an interesting timeline that you present, the 2031, for the potential of this beginning of the domino effect of the biological chain of life.
Actually, 2030 mathematically on this trajectory is not the beginning, it's the end. It means that mathematically at that point there's already nothing left, which means that right now, today, we are in the throes of resource wars all over the globe. I would argue 9/11 was a catalyst used to give a license for resource wars. And when it comes down to it, and this is sad, there are many people who don't really care if the government did 9/11 to justify their quest for resources around the globe. And I knew a couple of these people, they're no longer friends, that in a conversation when it came down to the issue of 9/11, that clearly that was, if you will, an inside job. They didn't really care. If that's what it took to keep them driving their BMWs and living their consumption gluttonous lifestyle, they didn't really care. And I can't accept that. Certainly that was where the friendship ended. But the bottom line is the resource wars are now. And if we're looking at mathematically a planet a northern hemisphere that won't support life by 2030, that means we're long gone by that point. And we have right now the statistical data on the temperature rises that are occurring. We're talking about temperatures on our planet above which humans have ever existed on the planet in only a few years, perhaps 6 or 8 years. Now, humans can certainly, if they could go inside and live in a conditioned zone, certainly in that sense humans could survive. But if the habitat doesn't survive and the resources that we use to sustain ourselves don't survive, we can't survive. And that equation is straightforward. In fact, we're on track right now, Alex, for what's called Venus syndrome. And I encourage people to look that up. And I encourage people not to believe me, not to believe anybody else, but to do their own investigation. That's the goal of our site. That's why we don't sell anything. We're not in this for anything other than to sound the alarm. But our problems are near. They're very near.
Very much so. And just to put the number out there, and I'll mention this more in future broadcasts, 218-339-8525, 218-339-8525. That is the call-in number. We'll be back with Dane Wigington. Of September 11th, the cover-up of 9/11. You're looking at a global job. You're looking at steel transported, shipped to China, never to be seen again. You're looking at Russian military troops outside countries like Uzbekistan, Afghanistan, in the days leading up to 9/11. Now, these are some reports that I saw, in conjunction with all the other material, that there's obviously much more to the story than what we've been told. And so, yeah, there's a lot of evidence that there's this global cover-up. And this time frame between now and 2030 and this focus on 2025. So here we are in the year 2015, and we're also seeing massive die-off of the bees, to mention that as well. And people have been talking about that for, at least about a decade that I know of. Do you think that this is something that started, people becoming aware of the bees dying around the same time that we started to see more geoengineering?
Well, certainly there's a connection. Again, for all the factors that we discussed earlier, all involved with this, the radio frequency, the massive saturation of bioavailable nanoparticulates. And so people understand how small a nanoparticulate is. It's inconceivably small. You can fit something like 50,000 across the width of a human hair. They're unimaginably small, so they infiltrate everything. And when we see all the quote-unquote experts in the studies on the colony collapse disorder with the bees trying to pin it on this chemical or that chemical, not that any of those chemicals are good, and they are certainly all harmful and all likely a part of the problem. But if bees of many species are dying, in some cases 1,000 miles away from the nearest farm, obviously something else is going on. And this is where, again, the quote-unquote academia and the agencies are completely, intentionally dysfunctional. And we have so many people in academia that want to stay in their bubble of denial. I spoke to one of the head bee people in the country about the climate engineering issue, tried to get her to investigate, but she has a lot of letters behind her name, a lot of degrees, and people in that scenario sometimes feel they know it all. And it's, as they say, it's hard to add to a cup that's already full. So she didn't even investigate the climate engineering issue. And we have a lot of people in that category right now. They simply feel the normalcy bias for them is so powerful that they cannot imagine that the reality we have known is coming to an end by the day. So again, what I would encourage people to do, it's not about becoming disabled with the reality of what we face. If you know you're heading off the end of the plank, why wouldn't you turn around and try to make a difference? Why wouldn't we do that? And again, this is the hour when we find out what we're made of. No matter how dark the horizon is, we stand up and try to change course, because we're all in the Titanic right now, Alex, every single one of us.
Absolutely. Now, and a lot of us that are involved in the world of sharing truth and controversial things, sometimes drama comes up and we find ourselves under attack. What are some of the things that you've seen in the movement, if you will, just along those lines of people creating drama? And there's some things that I see, it seems like everybody out there has been attacked for something, or had people just come after them and say that they're a fraud. I mean, what's your whole take on, the rise in these baseless accusations that we're seeing from people out there?
Well, we certainly expect to have attacks from outside the trench, if you will. It's unfortunate when there's attacks going on inside the trench with people who are supposed to be on the same side. That's very unfortunate. And I would only advise your listeners to simply look for data. Who's putting out data? Who's spending their time throwing mud? Look at it in that regard. So, some people seem to be in this fight and other fights for reasons other than the fight itself. There's something else driving them. And those kind of people just need to be left behind on the side of the road while the rest of us are trying to march forward. So, again, the goal is to continue to put out credible data, up-to-date data, and try to reach the widest audience we can. And if, for your listeners that are looking for that data, if you stumble onto a site or something from an individual that claims to be in the fight, but yet they spend their time throwing mud, probably time to leave that person behind.
And we do see in the YouTube comment section a lot of people engage in that behavior that don't have necessarily their own information. And so I'm just highlighting that for people that, get caught up in some of these things, to look a little closer at those that are actually spending time attacking people, whoever it is. But it doesn't matter what YouTube channel you go to. There's a lot of that behavior, and it's important to people to focus on what people actually create. What are the fruits of their labor, if you will. So we actually had a call come in, and we have a few minutes left. I think we have 6 more minutes, if I'm correct. And this is a phone call that's come in from the 865 area code. Caller, go ahead.
Hi, this is Marla Stairwood in Knoxville, Tennessee. Hi, Dane. I was just calling in to see if we could get some more information out there about what's happening in Tennessee because of the geoengineered storms out here in the east. If you've been following the news, the death toll is up to 30 now. And we were in a state of emergency, and many counties, especially in Middle Tennessee, are still without power. As I said, the death toll and the liability is on the rise daily, and it's just very infuriating to know these storms are engineered and people are dying.
Marla, thanks for the call, and you're absolutely right. Again, what they're doing can only be categorized as weather warfare against their own population as well, and biological warfare, because we are breathing what they are spraying. No matter what the intent, if the results are the same, it must be categorized as biological warfare also. And on that note, how many have died from respiratory ailment? We could never know or quantify. We know that the number is certainly in the millions or tens of millions right now, directly related to these programs. And we see respiratory mortality going off the scale. And what about all the peripheral ailments when we have ADD, Alzheimer's, autism, COPD? The list is absolutely endless. In fact, aluminum has now been linked. I've been to Stanford, met with the top bioscientists there, and they have conclusively linked now aluminum to obesity, type 2 diabetes. There's really nothing bad that these programs don't do or aren't connected to. So, again, one could never quantify the amount of mortality that has already been caused by these programs. And if we continue, the mortality will be total. This is what people can't seem to get their arms around. We will not survive on this track. Nothing will survive if we do not change course. And this doesn't just involve climate engineering. That's the greatest step, first step, most important step. But a lot of things need to change if we are to have any chance, starting with stopping climate engineering. So again, I know you're under the cold. You're under the cold out there, right, Marla?
Oh, it's bitterly cold, and we usually in the valley, Tennessee Valley, don't have a lot of snow or ice events. But if you've been following the news, we've had more than our share this year. And
if you look at
people don't seem to understand.
I'll post a video later in the day, Marla, where I had some screenshots of what happened in the last day of moisture coming down through Canada. It's raining in Canada north of the Montana border while there's patches of snow falling at the Arizona-Mexico border. That's because they can chemically nucleate wherever they want and cause snow to fall almost wherever they want, and it creates that cold layer at the ground while we're still frying out here in the West. So, again, I'll have a little more data up on that soon, but you're right, Marla. It's weather warfare and biological warfare, nothing short.
We'll watch for that data. As usual, I want to thank you for being so consistent, putting out credible, reliable data. If we can continue to get this out to the people and they will take the time to wrap their minds around it, it's easy to connect the dots and see what's going on. So thank you, Dane.
Thank you, Marla.
And thank you, Marla. Stay on the line. The producer at AFR wanted to speak with you, and we have about probably 2 minutes left. So, Dane, what thoughts would you like to leave us with?
This is what's most important about everything we disseminated today. Instead of people shutting down, feeling hopeless, and doing nothing, everyone has tremendous power in this equation if they simply utilize it. If people would arm themselves with credible data, again, we'll have the free downloadable business card side information cards in a few days. We already have the flyers up on geoengineeringwatch.org, free downloadable flyers. You can print them locally. Arm yourself with some sort of credible data to pass on to others, and make it your mission every day to wake up whoever you haven't spoken to yet. And if people are reluctant and resistant, plant the seed and move on and keep planting the seeds. Because, again, what's happening in our skies can't be hidden much longer, Alex. It can't be. The destruction is too horrific, and it's accelerating by the day. And in fact, and on that note, for those who have believed that the Arctic ice is expanding and that the world is descending into cold, as of 3 days ago, Arctic ice, all-time record low. Don't see that in many headlines, do we? Not many at all. In fact, we were told at the end of 2013 that the ice had expanded 50%. That was over 2012 when it almost disappeared. And they didn't tell you, here's what they didn't tell you, the mass, the volume, was only 19% of the 30-year norm. So a lot of lies going on. My goal is, I don't want anybody to believe me. I want them to actually research and understand that the reason I brought that issue up, there are things they can't hide much longer. If we plant the seeds now, Alex, they'll be forced to sprout soon. So everybody can exercise their personal power. Everybody can help in this fight.
Dane, thanks for coming on and sharing a lot of great information. What websites other than your own, GeoEngineeringWatch.org, would you recommend people check out?
Thank you for asking. In fact, an interactive site, this is how people can help. SkyderAlert.com, SKYDER alert.com, interactive app. I'm not a part of that, but the person who put it together is trying to help the cause. You can photograph the sky. The app will send it out to the legislators in your area. It'll help sound the alarm.
And to those listening, if you want to make a suggestion on future guests, go ahead and email me at Alex_Ansary. After the show is done, it's going to be available at American Freedom Radio in the show archive section. It's also going to be available after a few hours or a day over at youtube.com/AlexAnsary. So until tomorrow, Thomas Sheridan out of Ireland is our guest. I'm Alex Ansary reminding you the path to the ultimate place of power and truth still lies within. And we'll talk to you tomorrow. Take care.